Hello class. Today we're going to start a series of lectures on the U.S. Constitution, but today's lecture isn't on the Constitution, but it is on a Constitution, and I'll explain the difference in just a minute. Alright, so this is about the Articles of Confederation, or as I say there, America's first attempt at a Constitution. Alright, so you don't have to write this in your notes, but just remember, America declared independence from Britain on July 4th, 1776. Now they still had to go out and win the war, obviously, but they eventually did, signed the Treaty of Paris that gives them, where Britain recognizes their independence. But to be a separate country, what does America need? Remember, since 1607 and founding Jamestown, it had been part of the British Empire, so it had a national government over in Britain that was overseeing things. But once it's free, it's going to need its own national government. Right now, admittedly, each of the former colonies, now states, had their own state governments. But if they're going to be a union, okay, if they're going to be this United States, which they don't even really call themselves at first, that name kind of picks up steam as they're going through the Revolutionary War. But if they're going to be this united country, they're going to need a national government, some type of national government. Right? Which means they're going to need some rules for how the government works and what powers the government has. And ultimately, that is what a constitution is. A constitution is just a document that sets out the rules for the government. Right now, we're familiar with the Constitution of the United States, the one we still use. That's the one that says we have a president, runs for election every 4 years, has some amendments guaranteeing free speech, freedom of religion, the right to bear arms, etc., etc. All right, and we'll talk much more in these series of lectures about how that Constitution came into being. But today we're going to talk about America's first attempt to create a Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. Okay. So, during the Revolutionary War, the Second Continental Congress created and adopted what's known as the Articles of Confederation. All right, and they used that word confederation, I think, very purposely. A confederation is basically somewhat more of an alliance. A confederation isn't necessarily like a solid unified nation like we think of the word today. A confederation is more of an alliance of different nations. All right, and remember, I've been telling you this since the very first of the year. That's how the 13 colonies viewed themselves, as very separate, distinct nations, separate and distinct from each other. All part of the British Empire originally, but separate and distinct sovereign entities that didn't have to listen to what the other states said. So they're going to create this confederation. It's more of an alliance than necessarily a nation. That's where the Articles of Confederation gets its name. Now, the primary author of what came to be known as the Articles of Confederation was a guy named John Dickinson. He was from Pennsylvania. Wrote in 1777, all right, so the year after the Declaration of Independence was written. However, it's not going to be accepted by Congress for 4 more years until 1781, but it does start, or it's considered the nation's first constitution. Now, remember this 4-year gap. If you remember my lessons on the Revolutionary War, I told you that Washington spent more time during the war writing letters to Congress and to the states asking for money and supplies than he did actually fighting the British. And part of that is because of the dysfunction of the Second Continental Congress. It had this idea for confederation, but they didn't even adopt it formally for 4 years. So throughout the duration of the war, it wasn't really clear what powers the Second Continental Congress had. All right. Now, again, you don't have to write this. This is background. But exactly why did it take so long? It's because there was a dispute as to whether the national government or the state should control the Western territories. Remember, after the French and Indian War, Britain took all the land from France that was between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. All right, you see it on the map here on the screen. And for the longest time, all the colonies, their borders were basically the Appalachian Mountains. All right, that ring of mountain, or that row of mountains running more or less parallel to the Atlantic Ocean. But if America was going to win the war and take what was the Ohio River Valley as well as the other western territories away from Britain, well, now the country was going to extend all the way to the Mississippi River, and the question was, well, who got that land? Did the states get the land, the existing states, or were you going to create new states? You know, because there was an idea, especially in places like Virginia and North Carolina, as you see on the map, that didn't have any other natural borders. Like, well, we start at the Atlantic Ocean, we basically just go as far as the country goes. So if the country goes to the Mississippi River, then so will we. Presumably, if the country had gone to the Pacific Ocean way back then, Virginia or Carolina would have claimed that they went all the way across the continent. But however, states like Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, you know, as you can see on the map, they were locked in. They didn't go all the way to the Appalachian Mountains because they either had Canada or the Great Lakes or other states in between them and the land west of the Appalachian Mountains. So they weren't real keen on their southern neighbors basically extending as far to the Mississippi River as possible. So there was a great dispute as to who was going to get that land. And ultimately, it was decided the national government is going to control the Western territories. All right, that's how we are going to end up eventually with 50 states and not just, 13 really, really giant states. That they're going to say, okay, any new land goes to the national government. And then in part 2 of this lecture, we'll talk about some of the rules they came up with how to turn that newly acquired land into states. All right, so as I said, the Confederation, or the Articles of Confederation, written in 1777, not formally adopted until 1781. The Constitution we use today was written in 1787. So the Articles of Confederation were around no more than 10 years. All right, so why is that? Why don't we use the Articles of Confederation today? Because the Articles of Confederation created a national government that was simply too weak. Okay? I'm going to repeat that again, because if there's one thing you need to understand about these Articles of Confederation, it's this. All right? The Articles of Confederation failed because the national government was simply too weak. All right, so I'll give you a preview of coming slides, but essentially, the power was remaining in the states. Because remember, the states and the state legislatures and the governors of those states didn't want to share their power with the national government. They were fighting a war because of this, supposed tyrannical national government over in London. They didn't want to replace it with another strong national government in America. And so when the war breaks out, the Revolutionary War breaks out, and America declares its independence, all of the power is with the states. And there's one truth you should always keep in mind. When someone or some group of people have power, they are always going to be very, very reluctant to give that power up. And so the states were very reluctant to share any power with a new national government. So they ended up creating an article that was simply, where they wrote an Articles of Confederation that created a government that was too weak to ever be a challenge to the states. All right. And part of this, again, reflects their experiences the colonies had under a monarchy. All right. They felt King George and Parliament were being tyrannical, so they didn't want to create a government that was ever powerful enough to become tyrannical in and of itself. All right. So in the Articles, the state governments greatly limit the powers of national Congress. All right, so make sure you write down the details on this slide. All right, so what the Articles of Confederation established was a, quote, firm league of friendship. Again, that gets back to the point I was making earlier. Confederation is more of an alliance than it is a unified nation. All right, they were creating a league of friendship. All right. And to just make sure that almost all the states were in agreement with anything the Articles did, they required there to be 9 out of 13 votes. All right, so let me back up. Under the Articles of Confederation, each state received exactly 1 vote. All right, so whether you were Virginia or whether you were Rhode Island, you got 1 vote. All right, remember that, because when they create the Constitution, the one we use today, that is going to be a huge, huge fight as to whether you're going to keep that system or create a new one. But under the Articles, that was a system: 1 state for 1 vote. And you couldn't pass any law unless 9 of the 13 states agreed. All right, so now regularly, usually the way laws are passed is if more than half agreed, then the law gets passed. All right, so theoretically, that should have then been able to pass a law with 7 out of 13 states. That would have been more than half. But the authors of the Articles of Confederation basically wanted to make it difficult to pass laws. So you needed 9 of 13 just to pass a regular law. And if you wanted to amend the Articles of Confederation, well, it had to be unanimous. Right. So how does this unanimous consent requirement cause problems? Think about that for a minute. You have 13 states. Some are way up in the north. Their economy is based on fishing or timber. You have some rather large states in the south. Their economy is based on cash crops. You have your middle colonies in the north. In the Mid-Atlantic region, like New York, New Jersey. They're much more diverse, based on trade. How likely is it that all 13 of them are going to agree on anything? Okay, it's very unlikely. So when they made this clause that the Articles of Confederation couldn't be amended without unanimous consent, they were basically making it impossible to amend the Articles of Confederation, or at least nearly impossible. All right, so what kind of structure did it create? It created a unicameral. That's a single house legislative body. All right, so that means there was one group of people in the legislature. All right, so remember, L for legislate, L for laws. Legislatures are the branch of government that create and write the laws. All right. And so under the Articles, there was simply one Congress, one legislative body. And as I was saying, each state received one vote regardless of its population. And then Congress was given sole authority to govern the country. So, what could Congress do? Well, first of all, before I get into all the things Congress could do, look at what I left out on this slide. Congress is given sole authority to govern the country. Notice, and we'll talk about this in more detail in a minute, notice I did not mention any sort of executive, right? No president, certainly no king, but there's no executive. I didn't even mention a judicial branch. That's going to come into play here in a minute. I'll explain later. But what could Congress do? All right, theoretically and technically, they could declare war and make peace. All right, and after all, they wrote this during the middle of the Revolutionary War. They needed some sort of government, all right, to manage the war that they were fighting against Great Britain. They started fighting the war before they had a government. So they said, well, all right, we need a government. They can at least, declare war or eventually make peace with Britain when the time's right. So they gave themselves that power. Make treaties with foreign countries. Again, you're ultimately going to have a treaty with Britain once you win the war. So they gave themselves the power to make treaties. To establish an army and navy. And remember from our last lessons, we talked about, one of the first things the Second Continental Congress did was establish an army, put George Washington at the head of it. All right, so they had the ability to establish an army and navy. But look what I have in the parentheses there. They didn't have the ability to pay for it. And we'll talk about that later. So they could take out a piece of paper and say, all right, we hereby create an army. George Washington, go hire, 10,000 soldiers. And so George Washington went out and hired thousands of soldiers. And he said, okay, can y'all send them a paycheck? And Congress was like, oh, well, we don't actually have any money to pay them. All right. So that was going to be a problem. Think back to our lessons about Valley Forge and how malnourished and how undersupplied the soldiers were. Okay. So under the Articles of Confederation, the government could create an army and a navy, just didn't have any money to pay for it. They could establish a post office, which probably doesn't seem like a big deal to us, but remember back then, you didn't have TV, radio, email, texting, nothing like that. So the only way to communicate often was through a post office. Now they could issue, print, and borrow money. Again, they couldn't raise any money. So they could print money, but if you just print money without actually having any value, that money is essentially worthless. Just printing a piece of paper, calling it money, doesn't do you any good. But that's really all the power they had. And finally, they could hear disputes among the states related to trade or boundaries. The problem is they had little power to resolve them because the states had all the power. So if two states were arguing about where their border was, they could come to Congress, and Congress would basically create a sort of a temporary court and say, okay, well, we think this state should win or that state should win. But Congress then didn't have the power to enforce that ruling. So, you can consider how valuable this power was or wasn't. Okay. But as I said at the start, the Articles of Confederation left most of the important powers to the states themselves. All right, so we talked about what powers Congress had, but let's talk about the weaknesses. Because again, make sure you're getting this in your notes. The Articles of Confederation are remembered for its weakness, not for its strengths or the powers it did have, but for its weaknesses. So under the Articles, as I mentioned, Congress had no executive branch to enforce laws. All right, so if you think about the three branches of government we have now, the legislature writes the laws, the executive branch enforces the laws, and the judicial branch interprets laws. But Congress had no executive branch to enforce laws. All right, so think about that today. We may pass a law saying, okay, people shouldn't go around robbing a bank. But if you didn't have some type of police force to go stop people from robbing banks or to arrest people who did rob banks, then what good is that law telling people not to rob banks? There's no one there to keep them from doing it. And here, this next bullet point I just put up, especially when it came to waging the war, is important. Congress had no power to raise taxes. All right, so they couldn't pay that army or navy we just talked about. All Congress could do was ask the states for money. And often how that played out, Congress would send a letter or a request to the states, dear states, please send us money so we can give it to the Continental Army. And the state's response is, well, we're already paying our own state militia, so go ask some other state. Right? And that's one of the problems when you're trying to combine 13 states. All of the states basically worry about themselves and are hoping the other 12 states will take care of the more national problems, and then no one ends up doing anything about a problem affecting the country as a whole. All right, so this inability to raise money is a very, very big problem for the Articles, or for the Congress under the Articles. Congress had no power to regulate foreign or state trade. All right, so New York might pass one set of laws or taxes against trade coming in from Europe. Virginia might have a different set of laws. All right, so this kind of creates chaos throughout the country. Also, Congress had no power to force states to honor obligations. All right, so a state might say, okay, you know what, at the new year, we'll send you $50,000 for the Continental Army. But if the new year comes around and the states don't pay, Congress couldn't do anything about it. They might write a letter complaining about it, but that was about it. They couldn't force the states to honor their obligations, which is ultimately why Congress could not settle state quarrels such as border disputes. Again, the Articles, on paper at least, gives Congress the right to settle border disputes, or at least to hear the disputes. And so they would set up a temporary court, because there were no permanent courts under the Articles. They'd set up like a temporary court to hear these disputes. But if one state didn't honor its obligations, Congress couldn't really do anything about it, right? Which led to endless quarrels among the states and border disputes. And finally, Congress had no power to regulate the value of currency. Again, they could print money, but that money wasn't backed up by anything, and the states could still print their own money. All right, so there might be a U.S. dollar, but Virginia might have its own currency. New York might have its own currency. Or Massachusetts would have a different currency. All right, so the value of the currency was always ever changing, and it couldn't be controlled by Congress, which is one of the primary powers that the national governments do is issue currency and try to manage it. All right, so all of these are huge problems under the Articles of Confederation, and they're going to be problems that ultimately are going to destroy or cause the country to have to create a new constitution. Okay, now I've given a lot of problems with the Articles of Confederation, but there were some positives, there were some benefits. So even under that first constitution that created a government that was almost too weak to do anything, The government still managed to have some lasting successes, but we will talk about that last time. For this lesson, I just want you to remember that the Articles of Confederation, it was only one branch of government, the legislative branch, and that branch had almost no power to tax, and no power to force the states to honor any laws or obligations, and no power to enforce the laws that Congress did write. Okay, so ultimately, the Articles of Confederation isn't going to last. It's going to last at most 10 years. And it's going to be replaced with our Constitution. And so pay attention to these weaknesses, because when we get to talking about the Constitution, we're going to compare the solution, compare and contrast the Constitution to the Articles, and look at what the framers of the Constitution did to address some of those weaknesses and problems in the Articles of Confederation. So we'll leave it there for now. Next time we'll talk about a couple of actually good laws that were passed under the Articles.